Hey, this is Kevin with Division in America. In this presentation, we'll look at the concept of proportional representation, an alternative to the traditional winner-take-all voting system most common in the United States. The concept is most easily explained with an example, so let's jump right in with voting in U.S. congressional districts. Consider a U.S. congressional district of 200,000 voters that is 60% Republican, 20% Democrat, and 20% Independent, and that 11 candidates are running for election, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 3 Independents, and that voter preferences are distributed among the candidates as shown in this graph. Under our current system, each party would choose a candidate in a primary election, where turnout is much smaller than general elections. Here we'll assume a turnout of 50% evenly distributed across all voter types, with the primary winners indicated with a check mark. In the general election, the Republican candidate will win every time, meaning the Democrats and independent voters are never represented in this district under our current winner-take-all system. With proportional representation, on the other hand, we would increase the number of representatives chosen in that district from 1 to, say, 5, and have all candidates from all parties run together in one general election. Each party would be awarded congressional seats in this district in proportion to the number of votes received by each party. Now, when 60% of the votes are for Republicans, 20% for Democrats, and 20% for Independents, the top 3 Republicans, or 60% of the available seats, would be elected along with the 1 top Democrat, 20% of the available seats, and the 1 top Independent, 20% of the available seats. While Republicans still dominate the results, this gives voice to Democrats and Independents, along with those Republican voters whose candidates wouldn't be chosen in our current system. There are actually 4 types of proportional representation that can affect the results slightly, but our open list example shows the general concept. Finally, let's take a quick look at how proportional representation affects gerrymandering, the process used by the party in power in the state legislature to draw district boundary lines in the state in a way that will enhance their party's power. To show how this works, let's consider this geographical representation of a state with rectangular boundaries and 1 million voters. Each dot shown here represents 50,000 voters and their geographic location within the state, with blue dots representing Democratic voters and red dots Republican voters. If you count the dots, you'll see there are an equal number of voters for each party, 500,000 Democrats and 500,000 Republicans. Let's also suppose this state has been allocated 4 congressional districts, with the understanding that under federal law, all congressional districts within the state must have roughly the same number of voters. The question then is how the congressional boundary lines should be drawn. One approach would be to simply draw boundary lines down and across the middle of the state, resulting in 250,000 voters in each district. And as it turns out in this example, in a traditional winner-take-all system, this would result in 2 districts electing a Democrat and 2 districts electing a Republican, which turns out to be proportional to the number of voters from each party in the state, a 50-50 split. But now suppose the party in power in the state legislature, which determines congressional boundaries for the state, decides they can redraw the lines to favor their party, a process called gerrymandering. In this example, we'll say the Republicans are in power in the state legislature, although gerrymandering is in fact practiced by both parties. The diagram on the right shows how redrawing the congressional boundaries can effectively take a congressional seat away from the Democrats and give it to the Republicans. This is done by capturing a higher percentage of Democratic voters and a lower percentage of Republican voters in one district, leaving Republicans with a majority of voters in the other 3 districts. The result is that the state now has 1 Democratic representative and 3 Republican representatives, so this state's representation in Congress is no longer proportional to the number of voters from each party in the state. Now let's implement a system of proportional representation for the state, and we won't even worry about the gerrymandered district boundaries. We'll leave them just as they are, but now we'll increase the number of representatives elected in each district from 1 to 5 using proportional representation. We see now that in each district the number of representatives chosen is proportional to the number of voters, and the same holds true for the state as a whole when we add up the numbers for all districts. These results will hold no matter how the boundaries are drawn, since representation in each district will, by definition, be proportional to the number of voters from each party. And considering how much debate and controversy and legal wrangling is associated with boundary drawing in winner-take-all elections, this would be a big advantage of proportional representation. So to summarize, proportional representation gives political power to a broader range of voters and to more political parties who are otherwise left without representation in a winner-take-all system. In our example, we looked only at 3 parties, Democrat, Republican, and Independent, but it would apply to any party that had a significant number of voters, Green, Libertarian, Natural Law, and so on. Proponents also argue it helps avoid the kind of polarization we're now experiencing in the United States, where party loyalists from the 2 major parties effectively determine the winners in most of our elections. Critics of proportional representation argue it gives too much power to small fringe parties who will be needed by the other parties to form governing coalitions, and that coalition governments are inherently unstable since these coalitions can dissolve at any time. They say the 2-party system still represents the same multitude of views, it's just that coalitions are formed within each of the 2 parties instead of among the various parties. And finally, apart from all other considerations, there's no clear legal pathway for implementing proportional representation, since federal law calls for only 1 representative per congressional district. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to go into more detail on the pros and cons of proportional representation. The main goal here was to provide an overview of how it works. At the end of the day, however, any voting mechanism like proportional representation does nothing to address the root causes of the political divisions we're now seeing in our country, something discussed in different videos on this channel.